He was the man who could fly, the man who could stop bullets with his chest, the man who made an entire generation of children believe that heroes were real. But on a warm June night in 1959, Superman died. And the way he died would become one of Hollywood's most chilling unsolved mysteries. They found him in his bedroom with a single gunshot wound to the head. A Luger pistol lay at his feet. The police called it suicide, but the evidence told a different story. A story of jealous lovers, powerful enemies, and a cover-up that reached the highest levels of Hollywood's golden age. His name was George Reeves, and before that fatal night, he was trapped in a web of obsession, betrayal, and danger that would ultimately cost him everything. This is not the story of a superhero. This is the story of a man who wore a cape on screen, but couldn't save himself in real life. A man who was loved by millions, but may have been murdered by someone close to him. A man whose death was ruled a suicide, even though almost nothing about that night makes sense. Welcome to the mystery of George Reeves, a case that has haunted Hollywood for over 60 years. A death surrounded by lies, contradictions, and witnesses who knew more than they ever told. Tonight, we're going to examine every detail, every suspect, every clue that the police ignored or covered up. Because when Superman dies under suspicious circumstances, and the most powerful people in Hollywood want the case closed quickly and quietly, you have to ask yourself one question. What were they hiding? The truth is darker than you can imagine. The players are more dangerous than you'd believe. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why some mysteries are designed never to be solved. This is Starlet Mysteries, and this is the night we finally tell the truth about what happened. When the Man of Steel fell to Earth and never got back up. The night was warm in Benedict Canyon. June 16, 1959. The kind of Los Angeles evening where the air hangs heavy with jasmine and secrets, where the city's glittering facade begins to crack just enough to let the darkness seep through. In a modest Spanish-style home at 1579 Benedict Canyon Drive, a party was winding down. Laughter echoed through the rooms. Glasses clinked. Ice cubes rattled in crystal tumblers filled with expensive bourbon. But upstairs, in the master bedroom, a man sat alone in the gathering shadows. His name was George Reeves. To millions of Americans, he was more than just a man. He was a symbol. He was hope wrapped in a red cape. He was the Man of Steel himself, Superman. The hero who could fly, who could stop bullets with his chest, who could bend steel bars with his bare hands. Children across the nation rushed home from school to watch him on their black and white television sets. They wore his costume for Halloween. They pretended to be him in their backyards, arms stretched forward, imagining themselves soaring above the mundane troubles of childhood. But tonight, George Reeves was not Superman. He was a 45-year-old actor who felt trapped in a role that had defined him, consumed him, and ultimately destroyed any chance he had of being taken seriously as a dramatic performer. He was a man caught between the image the world wanted him to be and the person he actually was. He was tired, so very tired, The guests downstairs included his fiancée, Leonore Lemon, a sharp-tongued New York socialite who had swept into his life like a tornado. With her were William Bliss, a writer, and Carol Van Ronkel and Robert Condon, a married couple who were friends of Leonore's. They had been drinking for hours. The alcohol flowed freely, as it often did at George's house. Leonore had a reputation for throwing back drinks with the stamina of a longshoreman. And tonight was no exception. George had gone upstairs around midnight, complaining of exhaustion. The schedule for the Superman series had been grueling, and even though production had wrapped, the weariness seemed to have seeped into his bones, into his very soul. He told the group he was going to bed. Leonore made a joke about it. Something about him being an old man who couldn't keep up with her energy. The others laughed. George managed a tired smile and climbed the stairs to his bedroom. But he couldn't sleep. The noise from downstairs kept filtering up through the floorboards. Voices raised in alcohol-fueled merriment. The sound of ice being scooped from the freezer. More laughter. At some point, two more guests arrived. Neighbors who had seen the lights on and decided to join the impromptu gathering. Their names were Carol Van Ronkel's friends, though accounts vary on exactly who they were and why they showed up at such a late hour. What happened next would become one of Hollywood's most enduring mysteries, a puzzle that would never be fully solved. A question mark that would hang over George Reeves' legacy like a dark cloud obscuring the sun. At approximately 1:20 in the morning, depending on whose timeline you believe, George Reeves appeared at the top of the stairs in his bathrobe. He was irritated. The party had gone on too long. He couldn't sleep with all the noise. He spoke to Leonore, his voice carrying an edge that those present would later recall. He told her to keep it down. She responded with something flippant, something that might have been meant as a joke, but carried a certain cruelty in its delivery. George turned and went back upstairs. Then, according to Leonore Lemon's later testimony, something strange happened. She turned to the others at the party and made a bizarre statement. She said, and I quote, "He's going to shoot himself." The others looked at her, confused. It was an odd thing to say. Why would she think that? Had George threatened suicide before? Was this a running joke between them? Some dark humor that outsiders couldn't understand? Leonore didn't explain. She just took another drink. Moments later, the sound split the night like a crack of thunder. A single gunshot from upstairs, sharp, final, unmistakable. For several seconds, nobody moved. The party guests sat frozen, their brains struggling to process what they had just heard. Then someone said they should go check on him. But Leonore, strangely calm, told them to wait, to leave him alone for a minute. Another few seconds ticked by, seconds that felt like hours. Seconds that would later be scrutinized by investigators, journalists, and conspiracy theorists for decades to come. Finally, they went upstairs. William Bliss was the first to reach the bedroom. He pushed open the door and immediately recoiled from what he saw. George Reeves lay on his bed, naked except for a sheet partially covering his lower body. A Luger pistol lay on the floor between his feet. Blood pooled beneath his head. A single bullet wound marked his right temple. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, seeing nothing. Superman was dead. The official story. The one that would be stamped on police reports and death certificates would be suicide. A man depressed about his career, about his age, about his failing relationship, had taken his own life in a moment of despair. Case closed. But even in those first chaotic moments, inconsistencies began to emerge. Details that didn't quite fit. Questions that demanded answers, but received only silence. Why had Leonore predicted the gunshot? How did she know? Why had she told the others to wait before checking on George? Why was she so calm? And perhaps most disturbingly, why did she seem almost unsurprised when they found him dead? The police were called. Officers from the Los Angeles Police Department arrived at the scene around 2 a.m. They found a house full of drunk witnesses, a dead body, and a distraught fiancé who seemed to be going through the motions of grief rather than genuinely experiencing it. The lead detective on the scene was a man who had seen his share of Hollywood deaths, suicides, overdoses, and the occasional murder dressed up to look like something else. He surveyed the scene with practiced eyes. The Luger pistol was a German semi-automatic, a weapon commonly brought back by soldiers returning from World War II. George Reeves had served in the military during the war, though not in combat. He had been stationed stateside, making training films for the Army Air Corps. But like many men of his generation, he had acquired a souvenir weapon. The gun lay on the floor, supposedly dropped from his hand after the fatal shot. The bullet had entered George's right temple and exited through the left side of his head, lodging itself in the ceiling. The trajectory seemed consistent with suicide, assuming George had been sitting up when he pulled the trigger. But some details troubled the investigators, even if they didn't trouble them enough to dig deeper. There was no powder burns on George's skin. When a gun is fired in contact with skin, or even very close to it, it leaves distinctive marks from the burning gunpowder. These marks were absent. This suggested the gun had been fired from at least several inches away, which was unusual, but not impossible for a suicide. Perhaps George had held the gun at arm's length. Perhaps. There were also bruises on George's body. Fresh bruises. On his head. On his torso. When asked about these, Leonore explained that George had been in a minor car accident a few days earlier. That would account for the bruises, wouldn't it? The police accepted this explanation without verifying whether any such accident had been reported, or if George had sought medical attention for his injuries. Then there was the matter of the shell casing. When a semi-automatic pistol fires, it ejects the spent casing with considerable force, usually sending it several feet away from the gun. But in George's bedroom, the casing was found underneath his body. How had it gotten there? Had George's body fallen on it after the shot? Or had someone placed it there, staging the scene to look like suicide? The police interviewed the party guests separately. Their stories aligned in most respects, but there were discrepancies in the timeline. What time had George gone upstairs? When had he come back down to complain about the noise? How much time had elapsed between his return to the bedroom and the gunshot? The witnesses gave different answers, their memories blurred by alcohol and shock. Leonore Lemon's behavior struck some of the officers as odd. She seemed more angry than sad, more irritated by the inconvenience than devastated by the loss. She made flippant remarks. At one point, when asked about George's state of mind, she said, "He was depressed. He couldn't get work. He was washed up. Superman had ruined his career." Her words dripped with contempt, as if George's death was somehow his own fault, a weakness of character rather than a tragedy. But grief manifests in strange ways. The police reasoned. Some people shut down emotionally. Some become angry. Some make inappropriate jokes as a defense mechanism. And Leonore Lemon, they quickly learned, was not a typical grieving fiancé. She was a woman with a past, with connections, with secrets that would gradually come to light as the investigation progressed, such as it was. The coroner arrived and examined the body. George Reeves had been dead for about an hour by the time the medical examiner got there. Rigor mortis had not yet set in. The blood was still wet. The coroner noted the entrance wound, the exit wound, the lack of powder burns. He measured the trajectory of the bullet. He documented the position of the body. And then, with a shrug of bureaucratic finality, he made his preliminary determination: suicide. Probable suicide. The official autopsy would come later, but the conclusion was already forming in the days that followed. The story made headlines across the country. Superman was dead. The man who had embodied invulnerability had taken his own life with a single bullet. The irony was not lost on the media. Newspapers ran stories about the curse of Superman, about the tragic end of a once promising actor, about the dark side of fame. But for those who knew George Reeves, the suicide ruling didn't make sense. Friends came forward, adamant that George had not been depressed. Yes, he was frustrated with his career. Yes, he wanted to move beyond Superman and take on more serious roles. But depressed enough to kill himself? They didn't buy it. George had been making plans for the future. He was going to get married to Leonore in a few weeks. Though some friends whispered that George had been having second thoughts about the relationship. He had been talking about directing, about opening an acting school, about leveraging his Superman fame into new opportunities. And then there was the matter of George's previous relationship, the one that had ended just months before Leonore entered his life. A relationship that was far more complicated, far more dangerous, and far more tangled with Hollywood power than anyone wanted to acknowledge publicly. Her name was Toni Mannix, and she was married to Eddie Mannix, one of the most powerful and feared men in Hollywood. Eddie Mannix was a fixer for MGM Studios, a man who made problems disappear, who buried scandals, who knew where all the bodies were buried, sometimes literally. He was connected to organized crime. He was ruthless, and his wife had been having an affair with George Reeves for nearly a decade. Toni was older than George by 8 years. She was beautiful, sophisticated, and utterly devoted to him. She had bankrolled his career when he was struggling. She had bought him the house on Benedict Canyon Drive. She had given him cars, clothes, jewelry. She had used her husband's connections to get George roles, to keep his name circulating in the industry. In return, George had been her lover, her companion, her escape from a loveless marriage to a man who intimidated everyone around him. But George had wanted out. The relationship with Toni had become suffocating. She was possessive, jealous, controlling, and there was always the shadow of Eddie Mannix looming in the background. The unspoken threat of what might happen if George tried to leave. So when George met Leonore Lemon in early 1958, he saw a way out. Leonore was everything Tony wasn't. She was younger, wilder, more independent. She didn't care about Eddie Mannix or his connections. She encouraged George to break free from Tony's control. The breakup had been ugly. Tony did not take rejection well. She called George constantly, showed up at his house unannounced, made scenes at restaurants and parties. She told friends that George would never leave her, that he owed her everything, that she would make sure he regretted abandoning her. Some people who knew Tony said her threats went further than that. They said she had vowed that if she couldn't have George, nobody would. They said she had connections through her husband, connections to people who could make a death look like suicide. But these were just whispers, rumors, the kind of speculation that swirls around any mysterious death in Hollywood. The police didn't pursue this angle seriously. They interviewed Tony Mannix briefly. She claimed she had been at home the night George died, and her husband corroborated her alibi. Eddie Mannix himself was also questioned, and he expressed sadness at George's death, but nothing more. The detectives, perhaps mindful of who they were dealing with, didn't push to hard. The house on Benedict Canyon Drive told its own story. If anyone had been willing to read it carefully, it was the house Tony had bought for George. Her name was still on some of the paperwork. She had decorated it, filled it with furniture she had chosen. Even after George had moved Leonore in, traces of Tony remained. Photographs in drawers, monogrammed towels in the linen closet, a particular brand of perfume whose scent still lingered in the guest bedroom. The house was a monument to their affair, and now it was a crime scene. George's mother, Helen Basolo, refused to accept the suicide ruling. She hired a lawyer and demanded a more thorough investigation. She insisted that her son would never have killed himself. She pointed out inconsistencies in the police report. She questioned why the investigation had been so brief, so perfunctory. She wanted answers, but the LAPD stonewalled her. The case was closed. The coroner had ruled it suicide. There was no evidence of foul play. Her son was dead, and no amount of investigating would bring him back. Helen didn't give up. She hired private detectives. She pored over the police reports, looking for clues that the investigators had missed or ignored. And she found plenty. The lack of powder burns, the position of the shell casing, the bruises on George's body, the presence of a fresh drink on the nightstand that George had supposedly poured for himself right before shooting himself, which seemed like an odd thing to do. The fact that multiple guns were found in the house, but George had supposedly chosen the Luger, which was kept in a different room from his bedroom and would have required him to retrieve it. Before going upstairs, then there was the matter of fingerprints. The Luger pistol should have been covered in George's fingerprints, if he had handled it to shoot himself. But when the police tested the gun, the results were inconclusive. Some reports said there were no usable prints. Others said the prints were smudged. It was another detail that raised questions, but led nowhere. As weeks turned to months, other pieces of George Reeves' life came into focus. painting a picture of a man caught in a web of relationships and obligations that might have gotten him killed. The Superman series had made George famous, but it had also made him a prisoner. He was typecast to an extreme degree. Casting directors saw him as Superman and nothing else. When he auditioned for dramatic roles, directors couldn't see past the cape and tights. It was maddening for a man who had studied acting, who had worked in theater, who had appeared in Gone with the Wind early in his career. Albeit in a small role, George had been drinking more heavily in the months before his death. Friends noticed it. He would start in the afternoon and continue well into the night. The alcohol dulled the frustration, the disappointment, the sense that his career had peaked with a children's television show and would never recover. But it also made him volatile. He got into arguments more easily. He said things he regretted. And according to some accounts, he became increasingly paranoid, convinced that someone was watching him, following him, threatening him. Were these the delusions of a depressed man spiraling towards suicide? Or were they legitimate concerns? Had George Reeves made enemies who wanted him dead? There was Eddie Mannix, the cuckolded husband who had tolerated his wife's affair for years, but might have finally decided enough was enough. There was Tony Mannix, the scorned lover who had the means and motive to have George killed. There was Leonore Lemon, the fiancée whose behavior on the night of George's death raised so many red flags that some investigators came to believe she knew exactly what was going to happen before it did. And then there were the financial entanglements. George owed money to various people. He had invested in business ventures that had gone south. He was living beyond his means, maintaining a lifestyle that his diminishing income couldn't support. Could he have been killed over a debt? Over a business deal gone wrong? In Hollywood, stranger things had happened. The funeral was held at the Church of the Recessional at Forest Lawn Memorial Park. It was a modest affair, attended by a small group of friends and family. Leonore Lemon did not attend, which struck many as odd. She claimed she couldn't bear to see George in a casket, but her absence fed speculation that she knew more about his death than she was saying. Tony Mannix did attend, dressed in black, veiled, weeping openly. She threw herself on the casket and had to be restrained by Eddie, who stood beside her with an unreadable expression on his face. Noel Neal, who had played Lois Lane opposite George's Superman, was there. She was devastated. She remembered George as kind, professional, always ready with a joke to lighten the mood on set. Jack Larson, who played Jimmy Olsen, attended as well. He couldn't believe George was gone. None of them could. The official cause of death remained suicide. The investigation, such as it was, had concluded. But the questions didn't go away. They festered, they grew, and as years passed, new information would emerge that would cast even more doubt on the official story. In the immediate aftermath of George's death, strange things began to happen. The house on Benedict Canyon Drive gained a reputation for being haunted. Subsequent residents reported hearing footsteps upstairs, seeing a figure in a bathrobe standing at the top of the stairs, smelling gunpowder when there was no source for it. Neighbors claimed they saw lights turning on and off in the master bedroom late at night, even when the house was empty. Whether these stories were genuine or the product of overactive imaginations, fueled by knowledge of what had happened there, they added to the mystique of the case. Leonore Lemon left Los Angeles shortly after George's death. She moved to New York and then eventually to Europe. Over the years, she would give occasional interviews about that night, and her story would change in subtle ways. Sometimes she remembered George being angry when he came downstairs. Other times she said he seemed sad. The timeline of events would shift. The exact words people had spoken would alter. It's possible these were just the natural corruptions of memory over time. Or it's possible Leonore was trying to distance herself from the truth. She never remarried. She drank heavily for the rest of her life. And according to some who knew her in her later years, she was haunted by what had happened to George. In unguarded moments, after too many cocktails, she would hint that she knew more than she had told the police. That the truth about that night was darker and more complicated than anyone realized. But she never elaborated. She never came clean. And when she died in 1989, whatever secrets she held went with her to the grave. Toni Mannix also carried her secrets until the end. She remained married to Eddie until his death in 1963. After that, she lived quietly, never remarrying, rarely speaking about George to anyone outside her closest circle of friends. But those friends said that Toni never got over George. She kept photographs of him. She visited his grave regularly. She would talk about him as if he were still alive, as if their affair was still ongoing in some alternate reality where tragedy hadn't intervened. In her final years, suffering from Alzheimer's disease, Toni would sometimes become confused and ask where George was, why he hadn't come to visit her. She would insist he was coming for dinner, that they had plans. The disease had erased the knowledge of his death, but preserved her love for him. Frozen in time like an insect in amber, Eddie Mannix never publicly commented on George Reeves' death beyond his initial brief statement to police. But people who worked with Eddie at MGM in the years after George died said he seemed different, quieter, more withdrawn. The ruthless fixer who had terrified Hollywood for decades appeared diminished, as if some vital part of him had been hollowed out. Did he carry guilt for George's death? Did he know what had really happened that night? Or was he simply a man watching his own life wind down, aware that his era was ending and a new Hollywood was emerging that had no place for men like him? The truth about what happened to George Reeves on the night of June 16, 1959, may never be fully known. But one thing is certain: the official story doesn't add up. Too many inconsistencies, too many unanswered questions, too many people with motives and opportunities. Was it suicide? Murder staged to look like suicide? An accident somehow covered up? Each theory has its proponents, its evidence, its logical consistency, and each theory has its flaws, its gaps. It's moments where the narrative breaks down and leaves us with nothing but speculation. But to understand what really might have happened that night, we need to go back further. We need to understand who George Reeves was before he became Superman. We need to trace the path that led him to that house, to that relationship with Toni Mannix, to that engagement with Leonore Lemon, to that final moment when a bullet ended his life. George Reeves was born George Kiefer Brewer on January 5, 1914, in Woolstock, Iowa. His early life was marked by instability and secrets that would shape the man he became. His mother, Helen Lesher, was married to Don Brewer when George was born, but the marriage was troubled. Don Brewer was not George's biological father, a fact that Helen would keep hidden for years. George's real father was likely a man Helen had an affair with, though the identity of this man remains uncertain to this day. When George was still an infant, Helen left Don Brewer and moved to California with her son. She changed their surname to Basolo after marrying Frank Basolo, who became George's stepfather. Frank was a good man who treated George as his own son. But the marriage to Helen was rocky from the start. Helen was ambitious, strong-willed, and determined to reinvent herself in California. She had dreams of social advancement, of escaping her Midwestern roots and becoming someone important in the glamorous world of Southern California. George grew up in Pasadena, a young boy who was athletic, handsome, and drawn to performance from an early age. He participated in school plays and showed a natural talent for entertaining audiences. His mother encouraged this, seeing in her son's good looks and charisma a potential ticket to the life she wanted for both of them. But she was also domineering, controlling, living vicariously through George in ways that would later complicate his adult relationships with women. After graduating from Pasadena Junior College, George pursued acting seriously. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with classic leading man looks. His voice was deep and resonant. He moved with an athlete's grace. All the physical tools were there. He joined the Pasadena Playhouse, one of the most respected theater companies in California, and honed his craft on stage. The work was demanding but fulfilling. George discovered that he loved acting, loved the transformation that happened when he stepped into a character, loved the applause and approval of audiences. In the late 1930s, Hollywood was in its golden age. The studio system ruled supreme. MGM, Paramount, Warner Brothers, and the others controlled every aspect of film production and the careers of the actors. Under contract to them, getting noticed by a studio was the dream of every aspiring actor in Los Angeles. And George Reeves was no exception. His break came in 1939 when he was cast in Gone with the Wind, the epic Civil War romance that would become one of the most famous films in history. George's role was small, just a few scenes as Stuart Tarleton, one of the Tarleton twins who were suitors of Scarlett O'Hara in the early part of the film. But it was a start, a credit in a major production that gave him legitimacy and exposure. George hoped Gone with the Wind would launch his career into the stratosphere. He imagined himself becoming one of Hollywood's leading men, starring in prestigious dramas, working with the best directors, earning the respect of critics and peers. For a brief moment, it seemed possible. The film was a massive success. Everyone associated with it benefited from its glow. But the reality of Hollywood proved more complicated. George was signed to a contract with Warner Brothers, and the studio began casting him in B-movies, low-budget westerns, and action films that were churned out quickly to fill the bottom half of double features. These were not the quality productions George had imagined for himself. They were assembly line entertainment, forgettable films that rarely showcased an actor's talent. Still, George worked hard. He showed up on time, hit his marks, delivered his lines professionally. He appeared in films like The Fighting 69th alongside James Cagney and Torrid Zone with Sheridan. The roles were supporting parts, nothing that would make him a star, but they kept him working, kept his name circulating in the industry. Then came World War II, and everything changed. George enlisted in the Army Air Corps in 1943. Because of his acting background, he was assigned to make training films rather than being sent to combat. He spent the war years at bases in California and other stateside locations, appearing in educational films about everything from aircraft maintenance to venereal disease prevention. It was not glamorous work, but it was important. And George took pride in serving his country, even if he sometimes felt guilty that he wasn't fighting overseas like so many of his contemporaries. When the war ended in 1945, George returned to Hollywood expecting to resume his career. But the landscape had changed. New actors had emerged during the war years. Audiences' tastes had evolved. And George, now in his early 30s, found that the opportunities weren't there anymore. The studios were less interested in contract players and more focused on building up a small number of major stars. George was neither a star nor a character actor with a unique specialty. He was stuck in the middle, too good for bit parts, but not bankable enough for leads. The late 1940s were lean years for George Reeves. He appeared in a handful of films, most of them forgettable. He took whatever work he could get, including some stage productions and radio dramas. Money was tight. The dream of becoming a respected dramatic actor seemed to be slipping away. And then, when George was at his lowest point, unsure if he should even continue pursuing acting, he met Tony Mannix. It was at a party in 1948. Tony was there with her husband Eddie, circulating among the Hollywood elite, playing the role of the dutiful wife while everyone in the room knew that the Mannix marriage was one of convenience rather than love. Eddie Mannix was too busy fixing problems for MGM to pay much attention to his wife, and Tony had long since accepted that her husband's real marriage was to the studio. George and Tony struck up a conversation. She was captivated by his looks, his charm, his old-fashioned manners that were becoming rare in Hollywood's increasingly cynical post-war culture. He was drawn to her sophistication, her wit, and yes, to the power and security she represented. Tony made it clear that she was interested in more than conversation. And George, lonely and struggling, didn't resist. Their affair began shortly after that party. Tony was discreet at first, mindful of her husband's reputation and the scandal that could erupt if their relationship became public knowledge. But as months passed, she grew bolder. She started spending more time with George, supporting him financially, using Eddie's connections to help George's career. Eddie knew about the affair. How could he not? But he tolerated it, perhaps because he felt guilty about neglecting Tony. Perhaps because he genuinely cared about her happiness in his own strange way. Or perhaps because having his wife involved with an actor gave him leverage. and information about what was happening in Hollywood's social circles. Tony bought George the house on Benedict Canyon Drive. She furnished it, made it a home for him. She gave him a car, clothes, and money. In return, George was her companion, her lover, her escape from the emptiness of her marriage. It was a transactional relationship in many ways, but there was genuine affection there too. Tony loved George in her possessive, controlling way, and George felt something for Tony. Though whether it was love or gratitude or simply dependence is hard to say. The affair continued for years. Through the early 1950s, George and Tony were inseparable. They traveled together. They attended parties and premieres together, with Eddie's tacit approval. Hollywood insiders knew about the relationship, but it was one of those open secrets that nobody talked about publicly. Eddie Mannix was too powerful, too dangerous to cross. And Tony, for her part, made sure to maintain appearances when necessary, playing the devoted wife when Eddie needed her for business or social reasons. During this time, George's career remained in the doldrums. He appeared in a few films, including a memorable small role in From Here to Eternity in 1953, but nothing that elevated his status. He was making a living, but just barely. He was in his late 30s now, no longer the young hopeful with unlimited potential. Time was running out for his dream of dramatic stardom. And then, in 1951, an opportunity came along that would change everything. A producer named Robert Maxwell was developing a television series based on the Superman comic books. Television was still a relatively new medium, regarded by many in Hollywood as inferior to films. A lowbrow entertainment for the masses, but it was growing rapidly, and there was money to be made for actors willing to embrace it. George was offered the role of Superman. The producers had seen him in earlier films and thought he had the right look. Tall, muscular, square-jawed, handsome in a wholesome, all-American way. George was hesitant. He had spent years trying to establish himself as a serious actor. Playing a comic book character on television seemed like a step backward, an admission that he would never achieve the film career he wanted. But Tony encouraged him to take the role. The money was good. It would give him steady work. And who knew? Maybe it would lead to something bigger. George signed the contract. And in doing so, he sealed his fate in ways he couldn't have imagined. But that is where the story becomes even more complex, where the threads of George Reeves' life become tangled beyond unraveling. Because Superman would make him famous beyond his wildest dreams, it would also trap him in a role he came to despise. It would define him so completely that he could never escape it. And when he finally tried to break free, to reclaim his life and his career, forces both human and circumstantial conspired against him. The question that haunts everyone who studies this case is simple but profound. What really happened on that warm June night in 1959? Who pulled the trigger that ended George Reeves' life? And why has the truth remained so elusive for more than 6 decades? The answers, if they exist at all, lie buried beneath layers of lies, half-truths, faded memories, and deliberate cover-ups. They lie in the relationships that defined George's final years, in the secrets kept by Tony Mannix, Eddie Mannix, and Leonore Lemon. They lie in the files of the LAPD, some of which mysteriously disappeared over the years. They lie in the unspoken rules of Golden Age Hollywood, where powerful men protected their interests at any cost, and where an actor's life could be worth less than the inconvenience of a scandal. To understand the mystery of George Reeves' death, we must understand the world he inhabited, the compromises he made, the enemies he accumulated, and the desperation that may or may not have driven him to pull a trigger on himself. We must look beyond the cape and the symbol, beyond Superman, and see the man underneath, flawed, frustrated, frightened, and ultimately destroyed by forces he could not control. The story of George Reeves is not just about one man's death. It's about the dark underbelly of Hollywood glamour. It's about the price of fame and the cost of dreams. It's about powerful people who play with human lives as if they were pieces on a chessboard. It's about unanswered questions that refuse to die, no matter how many years pass. And as we dig deeper into this mystery, as we examine every detail of that night and the years leading up to it, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The truth about what happened to George Reeves is far stranger, far darker, and far more disturbing than the official story of a depressed actor taking his own life. Because if George Reeves didn't kill himself, if someone else pulled that trigger, then we are looking at murder, and not just any murder, but one committed in a house full of witnesses, staged to look like suicide, covered up by powerful people, and ignored by investigators who either couldn't see the truth or chose not to look for it. The mystery deepens, the questions multiply, and somewhere in the shadows of that long-ago night, the truth waits to be discovered. And so the mystery remains unsolved, frozen in time like a photograph fading in the California sun. George Reeves, the man who once made millions believe a human could fly, fell to earth in the most tragic and suspicious way imaginable. Was it his own hand that pulled the trigger that night? Or was it someone else? Someone who walked away from that house on Benedict Canyon Drive with blood on their hands, and a secret they would carry to their grave? The official record says suicide, but the evidence whispers murder. The witnesses told stories that changed with each retelling. The investigators closed a case that should have remained open. And the powerful people who surrounded George in his final days took their secrets with them into the darkness. Toni Mannix died in 1983, her love for George undiminished by time or tragedy. Leonore Lemon passed away in 1989, her cryptic hints about that night never fully explained. Eddie Mannix, the fixer who knew how to make problems disappear, died in 1963. His role in the events of that June evening forever unclear. They are all gone now, along with everyone who was in that house when the gunshot rang out. The house itself still stands on Benedict Canyon Drive, though it has changed hands many times since 1959. New owners come and go, some staying longer than others, some reporting strange occurrences, some feeling nothing at all. But the walls remember, the floorboards remember, the master bedroom remembers. George Reeves was buried in a small plot, his grave marked with a simple headstone that bears his birth name, George Brewer. As if even in death he was trying to escape the role that had defined and destroyed him. Fans still visit, leaving flowers, leaving notes, leaving questions that will never be answered. Was George Reeves murdered? The evidence suggests it is possible, perhaps even probable. Did Eddie Mannix order a hit on the man who had humiliated him by taking his wife? Did Tony Mannix, consumed by jealousy and rage, arrange for George to be eliminated if she could not have him? Did Leonore Lemon know what was going to happen that night? Perhaps even participate in it? Or was it truly suicide, a desperate act by a broken man who saw no way forward? No escape from the cape that had become his prison? We may never know the truth. The files are incomplete. The witnesses are dead. The investigation was flawed from the beginning. But the questions endure, passed down through generations of true crime enthusiasts, Hollywood historians, and anyone who has ever wondered what really happened when Superman died. George Reeves deserved better. He deserved a thorough investigation. He deserved justice. He deserved to have his story told honestly, completely, without the cover-ups and convenient lies that have obscured the truth for more than 6 decades. Tonight, as you look up at the stars, somewhere in the Hollywood Hills, a house sits quietly in the darkness, and if you listen carefully, some say you can still hear the echo of that gunshot, the sound that ended a life and began a mystery that refuses to die. The case remains open in the court of public opinion. The truth remains elusive, and George Reeves, the man who was Superman, remains forever trapped between 2 possibilities: victim or casualty, murdered or self-destroyed, a mystery wrapped in a riddle, buried beneath years of secrets and lies. This is the story of George Reeves. This is the mystery that Hollywood tried to forget. This is the truth that someone, somewhere, does not want you to know. And until the day comes when all secrets are finally revealed, when the last witness speaks from beyond the grave, when the evidence that was hidden finally comes to light, we can only wonder, only speculate, only search for answers in the shadows of a long-ago night when Superman fell from the sky and never got back up. The mystery of George Reeves endures. The questions remain, and the truth, whatever it may be, waits patiently in the darkness, hoping that someday someone will finally bring it into the light. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of Hollywood's darkest and most enduring mysteries. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share. And remember, in the world of Starlet mysteries, the truth is always stranger than fiction, and the most compelling stories are the ones that remain unsolved. Until next time, keep questioning, keep searching, and never stop looking for the truth behind the legend.